Hi, guys, and welcome to Charade Inc. I'm Dell, and I'm here with PJ, the founder of Archangel Protective Intelligence. We're going to be discussing the social and political climate of the United States and how the media manipulates the public's opinions on these matters. Hi, PJ, and welcome. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and the origins of Archangel Protective Intelligence?
Hi, Dell. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I started Archangel Protective Intelligence in 2008, and it was actually Archangel Self-Defense. I was teaching physical self-defense. And then when some of the political unrest and some of the rioting started, I really moved to a more information-oriented organization and studied some intelligence gathering techniques, and I really started helping people with issues from around the country so I could expand my reach a little bit that way. And so now I teach self-defense, I make self-defense content, and I do protective intelligence, which is just information gathering that is aimed at keeping people safe.
Awesome. And so let's start with the political unrest. What do you think is the biggest cause of political unrest in the United States today?
Desperation. I absolutely think it's desperation. We have been pretty much locked in our homes for a year. People have been afraid of each other. There's been a lot less socializing. There's been a lot less collaboration. A lot of people are out of work because of it. A lot of people are extremely desperate. People sat at home and got radicalized online. And people are right now very concerned and scared about things like inflation, gas shortages. I think there's just a lot of fear and a lot of desperate people going out there.
And what role do you think the media has played in the public's perception about what's going on?
I think they are, in this case, well, in all cases, really the devil on the shoulder. I think they're pushing people towards it. I think that they are making people afraid of each other. They're extremely divisive. We know that, a certain group watches Fox News and a certain group watches CNN, and we're always told that that other tribe is stupid or immoral, and they're always trying to do something to hurt us, to hurt our tribe. We should fear them. We shouldn't interact with them. We need to unfriend them. And there's certainly been a lot of stories in the media that have just blatantly come out and said that. Your uncle is a COVID denier, it's time to unfriend him. If your neighbor is a sheep, it's time to break ties with them. And so sowing division and fear, of course, is going to make people feel isolated. It's going to make people feel desperate. And isolated, desperate people do things like this. I always go back to the Arab Spring. And there was a young man in Tunisia who, because of government corrupt officials and corrupt police officers, was not able to operate his fruit cart. And he set himself on fire, which was the catalyst that set off the entire Arab Spring. So desperate people do desperate things. And we're in a real dangerous situation right now.
Do you think that any of these media companies are fair? Do you think that there are ones that may be worse than the others?
No, I think, they're all major corporations. CNN, Fox, all my MSNBC, they all represent major corporate interests. And so they all have an interest in pushing a product on you. And that product, a lot of times, is opinion, is thought. I don't think any of them are, you could maybe say CNN is a little worse sometimes, or Fox is a little worse sometimes. It's really hard to quantify that, though. I mean, how much worse are they? What metrics we're judging that by? But I don't think they're trustworthy at that corporate level for sure. There is a source called ground.news that is an aggregator of news, and what it does is it just rates, this is a right-wing bias, this has a left-wing bias, this is how much of a right-wing bias, this is how much of a left-wing bias. So I think things like that are extremely helpful. But no, I don't think anyone from your local newscaster up to the top rated news program out there is completely honest.
What do you think about independent media and political commentators like on YouTube, someone like Ben Shapiro or Sam Cedar?
Well, I have really good working relationships with a lot of independent journalists, I would say, independent videographers. I think the more voices we have out there, the better off we are. I don't think there's any reason that three big media conglomerates should control the entire narrative. I do think because there's so many voices out there that we do have to be a bit careful with that. If I tune on into Ben Shapiro, I know exactly what Ben Shapiro is going to say about a certain issue. I know exactly where he's coming from. And just to recognize that bias really helps a lot. And once you start seeing the bias, you can't really unsee it. And I think we need to be careful, because it's great and horrible that everybody has a platform now, because I can say whatever crazy thing I want. And there's certainly a number of people out there that I can manipulate to believe it, or just really want to believe it.
Do you think that there is anything that people can do or possibly watch instead to make sure that they're not being manipulated by these media companies?
I mean, what I would say is the best defense against it. Turn off your television, go talk to your neighbor, learn to communicate and cooperate with the people in your community. You will have a stronger community, and you will be less weighed down by the BS that the corporate media is selling you. But
And
learning to recognize bias, I think, is a really big deal. When you look at a headline, look at the framing devices they're using. Are they saying something bad about the president? Are they saying something good about the president? Is the headline making this person look stupid? Is it making someone look smart? Is it sensational? Do you want to read that? If if you want to read it and it seems sensational, that is your first indicator that something is wrong here. News is boring.
I definitely agree with that. And I think that it all ties back to people just want to feel like they're in the know and feel like they know more than the next person, especially if the other person has an opposite political opinion to them. And one thing that the media loves to do is cling on to so-called political scandals. It's always something gate now. What do you think is the biggest true political scandal in our history?
In our history, wow, you hit me with a really big one. Um, I certainly think some of the manipulation of the COVID data and to justify a lot of the measures that were taken to combat COVID, uh, we really adopted the Chinese model of lockdowns, and certainly we didn't get that harsh about it. No one was being welded into their houses. I think that's a very big scandal. I think things that surrounding 9/11, I'm not one of those people that the government did 9/11 or whatever, but they certainly benefited from it with all of the spying on its citizens and all of the government overreach and spending. I think there's a lot of cover up that still hasn't been exposed there. I tend to think the biggest political scandals, though, are anything that got us into war. And I mean, you can go back to Vietnam, you can go to Iraq, but these are things that not only cost men and women in our armed services their lives, but we blew up a lot of kids in the Middle East. A lot of Vietnamese kids were mutilated during that war. So I think anytime that you see something that justifies war, to me personally, that's a huge scandal because it cost people their lives.
Do you think that political corruption has gotten better in recent years or worse?
You know, I know there's going to be a lot of people that want me to sensationalize it and say it's gotten worse, or even that it's gotten better because of the fact that we have so many people have a platform to expose it. I don't think that it's worse or better than it ever was. Certainly people are very tribal these days, where if it's a Democrat scandal, the Democrats will come out to sweep it under the rug. If it's a Republican scandal, same thing with the Republicans. And so you will have your tribe that wants to apologize for whatever scandal you were involved in. But I don't think that it's any better or worse. I think government inherently is corrupt. The more power it draws onto itself, the more corrupt it is. And I think the argument can be said that, every president takes more power for themselves. And then what happens is the guy that they disagree with gets into office, and he just takes more power for himself too. So in that way, I certainly think that we are seeing a political class that is more shielded from political scandal. We see political scandals all the time. It's not shocking anymore. And they're in the news cycle for about a week and then they disappear. And nothing ever is done about these things.
What do you think would be the best way to balance the public interest in what's happening and a media's interest in profit?
I really think that the answer to that is the more voices we're seeing, more competition. Certainly a thirst for the truth. Those two things do seem rather opposed to me, though. I think it's really hard to balance that out, because obviously the media is there to make a profit for their corporate benefactors, and that does not always lend itself to truth. It lends itself much more to sensationalism and playing to the audience. But I think if we demand more truth, that's when we'll have it. We need to start turning off CNN, Fox News, MSNBC when they lie to us.
What do you think about independent creators like Project Veritas? They tend to be doing the citizen journalism, but they've also been criticized for their methods. Do you think that we can find balance between that, where we have people doing citizen journalism, but they're not taking shortcuts in doing it?
I think citizen journalism like that, and all of the criticism that can be lobbed at Project Veritas, the corporate media is 1,000 times more guilty of all of it. Now, have they manipulated things or taken things out of context? I think that would be fair, but I think they also have exposed a lot of actual scandal that would never be exposed if it was left up to the corporate media. I'm a huge fan of that kind of citizen journalism. That's the kind of journalism that usually gets to the truth. And so I think it's another one of those things where, for citizen journalists, it behooves them to be honest and trustworthy and try to get a reputation for that. But the more citizen journalists we have out there exposing corruption, the better.
What area of the political sphere do you think would benefit the most from citizen journalism?
I don't think there's a wrong answer to that. I think that every political sphere could benefit. I don't think any political sphere or ideology is incapable of being corrupted and is invincible to this kind of stuff. So I don't think that anything, or I think there could only be a benefit in every area. I am a huge fan of truth and transparency. And I think that's what is needed in our society. And fortunately for us, there's so many voices out there now that you can't hide the truth forever. It will come out.
I definitely agree with that. And that's one thing about YouTube political commentators. It seems to always be this race to see, okay, well, this is a story that's going to benefit my side, so I want to make sure I get it out. But there have been complaints about the way YouTube regulates its content. For example, Steven Crowder has repeatedly been demonetized for sharing his opinion. What do you think about how YouTube has influenced the type of political opinions that have been broadcast through its platform?
I can't tell you how much I despise it. I despise YouTube. I despise Facebook, Twitter, any of these big tech companies that are censoring content. I despise it. They want their cake and eat it too. In a lot of these circumstances, they want political protections for free speech, but they don't want to allow free speech on their platform. But there are other platforms like Rumble that are competing with YouTube and tend to be much less restrictive. Now, if Steven Crowder were to go on to Rumble, it would certainly take a long time to build back all the followers he had on YouTube. I suspect Steven Crowder is fine. I think he's probably living pretty comfortably right now anyway. But yeah, I think there should be, as people, I never really talk about government solutions, but as people, I think we should demand better from YouTube. And I think the more competition in that space there is, the better.
Definitely agree. And it's one of those things where, you know, people might chide at, well, just increase competition, but it really does matter to these organizations whether they are the only one in a particular space. For example, I know there was this big thing about Parler, and Parler being a competitor to Twitter, but then so many things happened, and Parler was essentially taken off of the App Store, and it seemed that these media companies were working in tandem with each other. So I want to ask you, what do you think about the fact that it does always seem, especially the big tech companies, are always working in tandem with one another? Parler is one example. Donald Trump being banned from social media is another. Yeah, I just want your thoughts on that.
So I think every industry or every corporation that would like a monopoly. We supposedly have laws against that, but obviously they're not enforced a lot of times. If it wasn't for government protectionism, they could never get away with this kind of thing. But yeah, Parler was an attack that, I mean, they wanted a monopoly, and they really used the January 6th thing. More people were coordinating on Facebook than on Parler during January 6th. If you really looked at Parler, and I never created a Parler account. I'm just not interested. But I certainly saw what went on there. And if there is the extremist content that they were claiming that was happening on there, I watch extremist content all the time. I watch it on places like Telegram and Discord and see some really gross stuff. And when I looked at Parler, I just didn't see that. I saw people that we would think of as kind of the Fox News viewer, the conservative boomer who the worst that you can say about them is they believe the wrong thing. They maybe are conspiratorial minded in a way that doesn't line up with the truth. But these are not dangerous people. A lot of these are, your average soccer mom from the suburbs. But they need to be called out for the fact that they are coordinating with each other to suppress free speech.
Definitely. Do you think that at any time in the near future that Congress would take a look at Section 230 and possibly reword it or provide less protections to these tech companies?
I would love it. I would absolutely love it. Congress does the bidding of their donors for the most part. So I don't see anything like that happening. We see people like Mark Zuckerberg get testified in or have to testify in Congress. And some congressperson will ask him to help them regulate social media. And there's nothing more Facebook would like to do than regulate itself and its competitors. It has advertising on television about how regulation needs to change and about how Congress should be taking a more active role in regulating that. And I don't think anyone's dumb enough to believe that there's some altruistic motive behind Mark Zuckerberg wanting to regulate himself. It's absolutely the same as Jeff Bezos saying, we need more regulations that will, keep the mom and pop stores out of my face. I think Congress is much more likely to be manipulated by the rich tech moguls than answer to its citizens, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, one thing that always comes up when you hear these like CEOs of tech companies and other very large corporations, they always say, well, I'm fine with more regulations, but the truth really is they can afford it. They can afford
Right.
so of course it's like, yeah, okay, that's just another possible tax write-off that I'm going to get because I'm going to find a loophole. And it seems like the media doesn't cover that part. They'll cover the testimony, they'll cover what the person is saying, but they won't actually cover the effect that it will have on the smaller businesses within the same sphere as an Amazon, as a Facebook?
Well, the corporate media does not work for the small business. It works in conjunction and for large corporations. Large corporations take care of themselves and try to keep competition out of their space. So there is a lot of manipulation and coordination going on there. It's called regulation capture. If any of your listeners are not familiar with the term, it's basically what Mark Zuckerberg is trying to do here. Is a big corporation captures the means to regulation and weaponizes regulation to control their competition.
Do you think that there's anything that the public can do to fight back against corporations and media companies doing this type of practice?
Yeah, don't give them your money. You got to vote with your dollars. I think that's the vote that matters most in our country. Vote with your dollars, give them to someone else. Look for competitors that you can support and demand action. You can certainly call your congresspeople. I don't think there's any harm in that. I don't think they work for you, but you can certainly call them, write them, and they tend to listen if there's enough people upset with them that they may not be reelected. The business of a politician usually is to get reelected, to make sure they stay in power. So if you can threaten that, they will listen to you.
It's definitely, I remember I was watching it was a segment, and they asked the politician what their job was. And the first thing they said was to get reelected. And of course, it was like, wait, no, your first job should be to help people. But it does seem like the cycle of reelection constantly has people more focused on the entities that are giving them the most money and not the people that are actually going to cast the ballots.
Absolutely. That is a very honest politician that says that their job is to get reelected. But there are studies done on how much of their time they spend campaigning. And the average politician spends about 80% of their time fundraising and campaigning for reelection. So they're not doing the work of the people. I think that they're much more interested in standing up and saying, look, we're doing the work of the people and getting some attention that might get them some votes than they are actually working for us. But I also really want to talk about some media manipulation that I don't think a lot of people know about. So do you mind if I kind of hijack the conversation that way?
No, not at all.
So the best illustration for this right now, the best example of it, rather, is Marvel movies. Do you like Marvel movies, Del?
I'm a DC person, so not on the Team Marvel train.
That's okay. I tend to like them both, but I like the Marvel movies better. I mean, Superman movies usually just make me want to cry. But the Marvel movies have had scripts that have been changed quite a bit. Uh, and a lot of it is with the influence of the Pentagon because they either make the military look bad or make the they portray the military industrial complex in an unfavorable light. But also the Chinese government has started to put their money into Marvel, and the best example of that is Doctor Strange, where they could not have a Tibetan monk. They ended up going with Tilda Swinton, who is a older British white woman, because they did not want a story of a Tibetan monk told in a positive light. But the Pentagon, the CIA, the FBI, the LAPD, the NYPD all have large liaison departments that liaisons with Hollywood. And so what we're seeing a lot of the time when we're watching television and movies is subtle manipulation that we don't even think about, but it's absolutely going on. And the only way to really combat it is to either turn that stuff off or start recognizing it and seeing it for what it is.
Now, I definitely have heard a lot of stories about how the Chinese government influences the way movies are made and what characters are allowed to be featured in. Um, it's definitely one of those things where it's weird because people always consider the United States to be the strongest country in the world. No way that any outside entity could have influence on what we do or what we watch. But the producers and the directors are definitely making a concerted effort to cater to the Chinese market, out of fear that their movies will not be allowed to be seen there, and then you lose, whatever sales that you're going to have there. And I think it's interesting because Disney as a whole has definitely been repeatedly accused of doing that. And on our podcast, we talk a lot about the LAPD and the CIA's involvement in different corruption cases and crime in general. And so it's no surprise that they would also have um, their hands on this as well. What do you think has been the most egregious example of the federal government sticking its nose into Hollywood productions?
The most egregious examples are during World War II, for sure. All movies were being pretty much used as propaganda at that point. Disney pretty much stayed afloat by making propaganda during World War II. But there are subtle changes all throughout media history. One of my favorite movies is called Charlie Wilson's War with Tom Hanks. Have you ever seen that?
I have not.
Okay, I would highly recommend it. And there's some truth to the story, but the CIA, and it was Chase Brandon actually came in from the CIA and rewrote some of the script. At the end of the book that it was based on, it's based on how Charlie Wilson, who was a congressman, was instrumental in giving aid and weapons to the Mujahideen to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. And the book ends on 9/11 and just kind of shows that to putting weapons into that region and encouraging these violent extremists and then kind of abandoning the region really did have some blowback. And so the point of the book was about blowback. And the CIA changed the ending of the movie. And there's none of that anymore. I mean, it really shows that these guys are the CIA agent who is, I mean, they have a wonderful, shady CIA agent in the movie, but they show the CIA agent and Charlie Wilson, and they're conquering heroes because they beat the Russians in Afghanistan. And they go through this little thing where Charlie Wilson says, like, hey, you're not going to give us money to build up schools and stuff in the region. You know, what do you think is going to happen if we just abandon these people? But there's no real substantive discussion of blowback. And so the whole work was completely changed.
I mean, that's definitely always the goal of the CIA, always trying to paint themselves in the best light so that people don't, dig deeper into all the different nefarious activities that they've been involved in. Do you think that there's ever a chance that the federal government or the large police departments would stop involving themselves in Hollywood if it was exposed more?
I do. I think that if there was large enough blowback, I think we're seeing very similar things with, police body cams and stuff right now, is there's such blowback and such demand and such anger that police departments are starting to think, oh, we need to at least appear more transparent and we need better appearances of accountability. And so, yeah, I think if there was enough demand and enough people that were upset about it, we would see those things change. Unfortunately, I think we see things go on with police on the streets. People pay attention to that stuff, but we miss the larger propaganda.
And finally, um, is there anything else that you want to share about media manipulation and how people can protect themselves from it?
Like I said, I think that it's a really big problem that we're so disconnected from each other. I think the more we can turn off the media and talk to your neighbor and put aside, oh, my neighbor votes differently than I do. You're your vote, I live in a very blue state. I tend to only protest vote, but let's say I was going to vote red. I know it's not going to really make a huge difference. There's no reason for me to be fighting with my neighbor who's just a huge establishment Democrat. She's a very, very nice person. And as long as we stay out of politics, we don't have any kind of problem. But for me to divide myself from someone along such stupid, petty lines, what's going to make your life a lot better is really connecting with the people around you. And turn the media off. Stop watching the news for a while. You will be amazed at what happened when you stop watching the news. If you want to know what's going on, tell people you don't watch the news. They will trip all over themselves to tell you everything that's going on in the news. You don't really have to watch it. It's like where I live in Minnesota. If you don't watch the weather, people will bend over backwards to tell you what they know about the weather. So we really don't even need the corporate media. You can get on any social media platform and see what's going on. You can talk to your friends, you can talk to your neighbors. But what's going to make your community better is not how informed you are about what's going on in China. It's really going to be about you connecting, helping your neighbor, caring about them, and voluntarily cooperating.
And that's where we'll leave you with the great advice, get out, talk to people in your community, and just make sure that you are not discrediting someone else's opinion simply because it's different than yours. Thank you so much for chatting with me, PJ. Where can people find you?
So I am at archangeloperations.us. I just wrote a book called Lessons in Personal Protection on Amazon Kindle, and that has some contact information for me there. But most major social media platforms, you can also just search Archangel Protective Intelligence. And I am not hard to find.
Thank you again for chatting with me.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Absolutely. All of PJ's links will be in the description. Have a great day, guys. Bye.